Tim Donaghy, disgraced human, but a guy who's refed in the NBA for a few years.
Right. Well, but we need to qualify this by saying the conversation that we had off the top of the show centered around Cathal Kelly's article in the Globe and centered around the idea that the NBA star-driven realities, that it's a star-driven league, that the Raptors don't get calls. How about that? How about we just stop with all the BS?
It is a predetermined thing that the Raptors will not make it through
that
the first
ESPN and the television networks in the league will make more money if Miami plays Brooklyn in the second round than they would if Toronto plays Miami, and that is at the heart of a lot of the calls. Never mind the fact that Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett have titles and have name recognition. So does Joe Johnson. He's been to all-star games and gets calls that way. That the Toronto Raptors get jobbed than they have been for years by calls. Now, there have been some quotes from the Raptors that lend to this idea, because in the past, I've said this before, I thought it was just a fan-driven idea based on biases that you have because you love your team. And completely understandable.
Completely.
But things like Dwayne Casey saying, I'm not going to comment on the officiating except to say that I went back to look at the calls on tape and we didn't get any. That's unusual. Speaking about game number one.
Unusual for him because his line is, I like my money.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see Dwayne Casey get to the line that close at all when it comes to the officials.
Right.
So that's a pretty interesting quote from him.
Several Timmins citizens weighing in when I brought it to them. In fact, 90% believe, or at least it seemed like 90% believed, that the Raptors get jobbed. Chris Black writes in, says, I watch a lot of NBA basketball, and it's also possible to believe that refs are favoring the Nets without being a crazed fan, a quote, crazed fan. So several people that interact with this show that we know have legitimate opinions feel like the Raptors aren't getting their fair share of calls. Now, both of us broke it down, and I think we agreed on what we thought.
I agree. I believe, and if Tim would stop, it can talk anytime in the next 30 seconds. I don't want to misquote you.
No, go ahead.
This is kind of a frenzied thing that doesn't have any meat.
That if you didn't lose game one,
there'd be no conversation. Everything's fine.
Right.
Everything's fine with the world.
Right. But there were no, it's a stat, there were no fouls called in the fourth quarter against the Nets.
Correct.
In game one.
That happened.
A game that the Toronto Raptors lost, which tends to whip fans into a frenzy.
Is that a common thing? No.
No.
I'll be the first one to admit it. But this, us against the rest of the basketball world.
Because we're the only Canadian team.
And the business of the NBA doesn't want the Raptors in there is not something I can swallow very easily. And I know why it's out there. I understand why it's out there. I'm a little smarter than that.
So earlier today, Jeff Blair has Tim Donaghy on the show. And if you don't know who Tim Donaghy is, he's a disgraced former referee.
Disgraced.
Who was caught gambling on games that he officiated.
But he has been in rooms. He has been on courts.
Right.
And he has had conversations that you and I would not necessarily have had.
Right. He's a snake. However, a lot of people thought that of Jose Canseco.
Snakes have been right sometimes.
A lot of people thought that about Floyd Landis. Yeah. And both those snakes turned out to be right.
Correct.
So, with a grain of salt, listen to what Tim Donaghy tells Jeff Blair about how the NBA trains their referees.
What I said before the series took place was that Brooklyn definitely would be put at an advantage in this situation for a lot of reasons, and mainly some of the reasons that you touched on. A Brooklyn-Miami matchup would bring great ratings, and, you know, that's what this is all about for the NBA and the league offices, bringing in as many dollars as they possibly can.
Okay. That there's a can of worms, and he's got one of those magic ones that they advertised in CFMT back in the day. You know, the ones that lifted the cap off without you even having to touch it.
Oh, what a scam that was.
You know that one that I'm talking about?
Like the erasable pen.
Yeah. It never really worked. Paper
Garbage.
Made. So he's got the can of worms, and he's starting to twist the top off of it.
Or the can of tuna.
No, just worms. A can of worms. That's the.
But what if you don't like tuna? It's also a similar type of analogy. So open a can of tuna. You don't want to see it. Okay. You're right. Can of worms probably works better. Okay. Just trying to start a new thing here.
No problem. I'm with you.
All right. So what's it? We got a few here, Tim. Let's just roll through them.
All right.
This is beyond interesting.
Here's Tim Donaghy, number 2.
It's a situation where the things that the league does and continues to do to put some of these teams at a disadvantage, like the Toronto Raptors, because moving forward, they're not going to what we call is bring in those big dollars for the league, basically is terrible for the fans of Toronto and the way that, they go and support that team, and they really are going to have trouble moving on based on talent and what takes place on the floor when they're really going against the referees in the league also, along with the Brooklyn Nets.
Okay. More fuel.
All right. Well, he's got kerosene.
Oh,
there's a fire,
okay.
And he's standing there like this, just spraying that kerosene all over the fire.
Hey, Tim. Billy Joel once asked, he said, we didn't start the fire.
No, Tim Donaghy did.
Yeah,
actually, Tim Donaghy.
We know who started that fire.
Right, and he's just pouring it all over it. How do refs tend to handle those situations, Tim?
If you're going to continue to want to progress up the ladder and make more money, and as you progress up the ladder, have a higher status to where you're going to be a referee for maybe 30-some years, like Joe Crawford and Dick Bavetta, and be very successful. You're going to do what the league wants.
All right, so in order to play ball with the league, you got to do what they say. All right. It's one way of looking at it.
And finally,
this is a strange one for me.
And finally, Toronto fans pay particular notice to this one because he's speaking to you directly.
When I look at the referees for tonight's game, for example, if we're going to do that, we're going to look at McCutcheon, Jones, and Gary Zielinski. If you're putting Gary Zielinski and David Jones in an arena like Sacramento or Portland, a situation where the fans are very boisterous and they come down on you at every call, that home team's definitely going to have a little bit of an advantage because they're what we consider in the referee world kind of like homer referees, where they don't really want to go against that, tough crowd. And this isn't a knock on Toronto and their fans, but they don't have that type of crowd that some of these other arenas have. So if they did, I would say that Toronto would be in good shape tonight, but they really don't have that crowd that comes down on the referees, like they would need to influence them.
And with that said, I wasn't there Saturday. I heard that crowd was pretty hype.
Yeah, it sounded pretty hype.
But historically, I know what he's trying to say.
Correct.
Like, I get it.
Do you realize how much, with how much fever people are writing into this show as we speak? And telling us, Tar writes in and says, grow a couple, you guys. You're bailing on the experience. No fouls in the fourth quarter is BS. Sorry, you're wrong. And he's just one of many right now saying, you guys are completely lost, and this is a thing. And it's happened before, and it will happen again.
I'm not mad at him. I get that opinion.
Right.
I get why it's out there. I completely disagree with it.
But why? You have to explain why you disagree.
I disagree with it because...
I know you did it at 1 o'clock, but some people might not have been around.
I disagree with it because if you watched the game with your eyes, they lost it in a lot of areas. And it wasn't no calls in the fourth. It really wasn't. It was DeMar 3 of 13. It was 19 turnovers. It was 6 by Jonas. It was not getting a stop. It's letting Joe Johnson put up a floater from 3 feet out on numerous occasions. And an inability to lock down defensively, which you've done, aside from the last 3 weeks, for most of the year since the Rudy Gay trade.
Mm-hmm.
You really think this is happening? That's on you. I got eyes, and I've seen basketball before, and the Raptors weren't good enough Saturday.
They weren't good enough, and it feels like there's a little bit of a female dog transpiring here from the Toronto fans because they didn't win. Let me just ask you, if there were no fouls called in the fourth quarter and the Raptors won, would you still have beef with it? If the Raptors won by 10, if they won by 2, would you still have as much a beef with that because they are taking on. Here's the deal. The NBA struggles with their officials in every. Go talk to Clipper fans after game 1 of the Clippers and Warriors series when Blake Griffin fouls out in 19 minutes of play.
I hate to burst your bubble, guys. There's a lot of teams who think the reffing sucks.
Right.
It ain't you. I hate to just completely kill everything. The reality is NBA officials are the worst things on earth. And not just in this market.
It's very tough. So what they do is they lean on experience of players and they lean on guys that they know. And when you have world champions and multiple all-stars on the other team, like the Brooklyn Nets have, they tend to get more of the calls. When you haven't made the playoffs in 6 years and you have one all-star on your team who just made his first all-star game, you're not going to get the bulk of those calls. And as unfair as you may feel it is, it happens across the NBA and not just in Toronto. Go watch a Milwaukee Bucks game. You were sitting beside me when I think it was Ed Malloy who refereed that first game between the Nets and the Raptors.
That guy sucked.
Do you remember what? And no, he's one of the better referees in the game. And I was saying, oh my goodness, how did you not call that on Brandon Knight? And you know what it was? The Raptors were getting the benefit of the calls because they were at home and they were playing a crappy Bucks team. That's just the way it is, right? Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember that.
We're sitting baseline and I was chirping the referee on behalf of the Bucks.
I started it, but then you just got into it.
Yeah.
One Coors Light later, McAuliffe gets into it.